Hey, it's Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio and host of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. Run to our website, peopleofdistinction.org for more info, or you can always email me directly at benji@alcoleenterprises.com. And on the line with us today, we have Tracy A. Ripley. We're going to be discussing her amazing book, Prayerful Warrior Mom, Embracing Faith Through the Storms of Your Child's Congenital Heart Journey. Now, it's available for purchase through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much wherever books are sold. But if you want to gather everything that Tracy has in store, well, people, do yourself a favor and head directly to her personal site. And that's prayerfulwarrior.com. There you'll find more information on Tracy herself, more information on this fantastic book, as well as find the hyperlink set up to take you to the purchasing pages. So one more time, that's prayerfulwarrior.com. And before we go any further, I do want to take this opportunity and point out that Tracy was brought to our network, People of Distinction, today by one of the best advertising firms in the business. And people, you already know, of course, I'm talking about Author Reputation Press. So listen to me. For my writers out there that have gone through their process, spending some sleepless nights, creating their masterpiece, but now you've done it, right? That time that you've invested has all paid off because you have it there within your reach and you've completed it. Although one thing you overlooked was now that you have that masterpiece created, you need help moving it. Well, if that's you, head on over to authorreputationpress.com today and gather all of the ways that their fantastic team is going to help you do just that. I'm telling you, they're one of the best in the business to do it, and this is exactly what they specialize in. So once again, that's authorreputationpress.com. Head on over there and see all of the ways that they're going to help maximize your creative endeavors. And listen, it is a true pleasure. I mean, an absolute delight to have Tracy here on the line. Right there in the subtitle, well, people, you have a great snapshot into what this book embodies, into what this book discusses. But I'm telling you, this book is nuanced. This book is layered. And although you're going to have a great understanding of what it entails, until you pick up the book and until you journey through those pages, you're never going to be able to have the full embodiment of what it symbolizes. Because we're going to learn about the remarkable true story of her and her family's journey and how they dealt with this monumental obstacle that was placed on their path. And there are going to be some challenging moments to get through. But people, please understand me when I say this is a story of hope. This is a story of inspiration. This is a story filled with powerful lessons that you can take into every single hurdle that comes along your path. You may not be able to completely relate to the exact obstacle that Tracy and her family have encountered in the battle that they deal with every single day. But I'm telling you, the underlying foundation that this book has and what it symbolizes is something we can all take to the bank, right? Because that notion of with God by your side, you are never alone. I love that. Listen, you can take that word God and you can replace it with whoever your particular God is or that higher force that you believe in. I promise you, this is not a book specific to religion. You're going to be able to take it regardless of your belief. If you can read between the lines and take that foundational message, that's truly where the power is. You know, and I'll be the first to say it, people. I remember at a very early age, dealing with certain obstacles that I had encountered. It became very clear to me that God never places anything in your path that you aren't strong enough to overcome. Now, it may not seem like that in the moment. In certain times, you may want to give up. You may want to throw in the towel. But with his guidance, with his assistance, being able to put your concerns and your worries into his hand and let him, for lack of a better term, take control of that car of life for you. My goodness, there's no better feeling of protection that you can receive. Listen, I could sit here and I could talk for hours. Okay, you all know I'm very verbose. But this book is magnificent for so many reasons. I've only scratched the surface. By the time we've concluded, you're going to run to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, prayerfulwarrior.com and pick up your copies because you're going to understand how monumental of a book this truly is and what a valuable resource it can be for you and your family. And at the end of the day, don't take my word for it. Take Tracy's. It's her book. She's written it. It's her life she's pulling from. She's going to be able to articulate everything much better than I ever could. So sit back and strap in. Tracy, first and foremost, welcome to People of Distinction, and thank you very much for being a guest. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Benji, for that wonderful intro. I'm grateful to be here on your show.
Well, listen, the pleasure is all ours, Tracy, and I'm just going to say you thanked me for my intro, but technically you started it, okay? I mean, you wrote this magnificent book and laid down such a great map for me to follow. So it really was easy because I'm following your lead. But joking aside, levity aside, Tracy, what you've done here is something special. I really do mean that because how much it's going to resonate with our listening audience at large. I think this is something amazing and really something that needs to be on everybody's shelf. So welcome to the network. Thank you for writing the book. And before we go into the words on those pages, Tracy, let's learn a little bit more about yourself. Who is Tracy A. Ripley?
I grew up in a Christian home with my three sisters in Northeast Ohio, where the church bus came every Wednesday evening and every Sunday morning to take us to church. And that's really where I would say my foundation as a child of God started.
Mm-hmm.
But as I grew older, I kind of stepped away from going to church. I wasn't going regularly because I didn't take the traditional route to college. I was working a full-time job. I was going to college full-time, but I was going at night and on weekends.
Yeah.
And all at the same time of trying to find time to see my stepchildren. So it really wasn't until my husband Rob and I had our youngest daughter, then I started realizing that we needed to make God more of a priority in our lives. So by then, we'd been married 10 years, and I was, working. I was trying to move up the finance career ladder, but I always knew that I wanted my children to have the same foundation that I had growing up, and I wanted them to know Jesus.
Yeah.
So about the time when my daughter was ready to start Sunday school, so she was old enough to start going, we started going to church. And at that same time, I was also being mentored at work for a higher level leadership role. Around the end of that year, that same year, I actually became pregnant with our youngest son. And so I'm going to fast forward now a little bit to a month before my youngest son was due to be born. I was actually promoted and earned a role as the only female global business finance manager in the segment that I supported.
Wow.
So by that time, I had been in accounting and finance for 2 decades. I had, so earning that promotion and that role, I felt like I was at the peak of everything I had been working for in my career, never expecting that 3 weeks later, our son would be born and diagnosed with a congenital heart disease. And that's really what became the decade-long journey that was the basis for my book.
Tracy, a magnificent way to start. And listen, I was going to offer a reflection. It's not even right to do that. Let's just keep the train going here. Let's jump into the book, Prayerful Warrior Mom. Tell us a little bit more about it.
So my book is about the decade-long journey of our son's battle with congenital heart disease. And it's also referred to as CHD, so if I use those terms interjectively, it's kind of known that way in the heart world. The book is told through the eyes of me, his mother, and I share many of the lessons that we learned through years of doctor visits, hospital stays, and countless surgeries, where I learned to be an advocate for our son. I learned to speak up when doctors waved away my concerns, and I learned to set healthy boundaries at work so that I could maintain a better work-life balance.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key things in my book that I talk with, and I've talked with some other heart moms, that's kind of what our title in the CHD world, that the struggle with guilt was tremendous. Very early on when my son was first diagnosed, I blamed myself because I felt that I worked too much. I didn't get enough sleep. I wasn't drinking enough water. And I felt guilty for taking on that stress-induced role right before, when I was pregnant with him. It didn't matter that the doctors had told us, nothing that I did or anyone else did caused his condition. And they threw lots of statistics at us that said, 1 in 100 babies are born with CHD in the United States every year. But I still replayed my pregnancy over and over, blaming myself. Yeah. And that's where I dedicated an entire chapter in my book that speaks to forgiveness and how I had to learn to forgive myself and to turn that burden over to God.
Tracy, I think your book is powerful for so many reasons, and a lot of the notions that you touch up on are magnificent. But one thing that I continued to come across in doing research and preparation for today's interview was that notion of guilt. Because as a parent myself, and I know my wife can attest to this as well, because we have had conversations like this, but you do take that on, right? I mean, regardless of whether or not it actually makes sense or if the statistics back it up, as parents, how often do we look at something that has happened with our children and we look at ourselves and say, we are to blame for X, Y, or Z? And I love that notion because I think, at least for me, that was one of the most powerful things that resonated as a parent. And I really want to stay here and focus on that a little bit more, of course, without giving too much away. But you talk about that sense of guilt and how you dealt with that throughout the process and putting your concerns in God's hand. But I want to go a little bit further in depth with it for anybody out there listening in, whether they have a child that is battling their own potential health issues. But just as a parent itself, like I said, your child trips because their shoes wasn't tied. I look at myself and like, man, I should have tied their shoes. I knew I should have double knotted it, right? Even the smallest things. I want to go a little bit more in depth with that. Talk to us about how you forgave yourself and what that process looked like.
Well, I can tell you it was not something that occurred overnight.
Yeah.
And I would honestly say it probably wasn't until my son was about 2.5 when I could officially say that I had let go of all of that self-blame and guilt. Mm-hmm. But again, I have to point to my journey with faith. I actually had attended a sermon at my church, and my pastor was talking about there's a scripture in the Bible where it talks about God says to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. And Paul keeps asking him to remove this thorn in his side. And again, 2 more times, God comes back and says, my grace is sufficient for you. And that's when I was like, well, I don't understand this scripture. But then as my pastor kept talking, and she was explaining that, like, God doesn't inflict things on us. He doesn't punish us, which is, I kept thinking, I've done something, this is my fault. I'm to blame for this. And she conveyed that that's not how God works, but he will use that. He will use that infliction, that pain, to help bring beautiful things or help new lessons, new blessings out of that pain that I had to learn to let go and to trust in him and to stop blaming myself, that it wasn't anything I or my husband or any of us did, that this is one of those things, like I said, 1 in 100 babies are born with CHD, and many of them are not even known as to what the cause are. There's about 15% of them where they can point to a genetic condition. All of the rest, they still, don't have a specific reason. And I had to turn that over and give all of that hurt and resentment and anger to God. And it was like this huge burden that just left my shoulders after I was finally able to release that and let go of it.
Wow. People, I'm telling you, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, prayerfulwarrior.com are the places you have to go. This is a book for you. Regardless of your circumstances, the lessons taught in this book are going to help you through so much. And I look at this, and truly is, when you read between the lines and you hear her talk about her faith and how much of a strength that gave her. I'm telling you, this is a copy and paste thing where you can take the notions and apply it to any obstacle you are facing. This is why this book carries so much weight. It's called Prayerful Warrior Mom. Head on over to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, prayerfulwarrior.com, and pick up your copies today. Tracy, next question that I'd love to get into. I am fascinated by your title, right? It is something that I look at and it's enticing. It's powerful, right? And it is something that I look at it and I'm saying, I envision my wife and she fully embodies this. I want to hear it from you. Why did you choose that title to be the representation for your book and connect it for us to the narrative itself?
Sure. So I actually combined two things in my world. So I mentioned in the heart community with the congenital heart conditions, mothers refer to themselves as heart warrior moms or heart moms. And many times our CHD children are called CHD warriors. So I kind of combined that aspect of being that warrior mom and fighting and advocating for my child. So I mentioned earlier there were times when there were concerns that came up with my son, and doctors would we even had nurses that waved away my concern, and it actually ended up being a valid concern that we had to deal with. And so I had to learn how to stand up for him, because he was an infant. He couldn't speak, and I was the one that knew him the best. I know his eating, his sleeping patterns, what noises he makes. And when I looking at him saying, this is not normal, something's wrong, then, I had to learn how to speak up and do it in a way where I didn't get kicked out of the NICU, but I had to fight for him. And so sometimes standing up and being that advocate can actually mean life or death for your child, because there were times in our story where it almost cost my son his life.
Wow.
So that was one of the things in terms of, being that warrior for our child, and what I tried to convey in my book, that you have to be able to stand up and speak for them. And the prayerful part is, as I mentioned, my faith, I was always, as I said, I came from a Christian home. I always had faith in my life, but it wasn't until we went through such challenges and some of the darkest moments in my life when I would feel alone and distance from God. Those are the moments when I would realize, I had not been pulling him along with me. I was trying to do it all on my own. And it wasn't until I reached for him through prayer and asked him to come into my life and to walk with me, and I started thanking him for the blessings, even in those times when is the darkest moments of our journey. I was still thanking him for the blessings, that my son was still there, that he was still fighting, that we had good doctors and access to good health care. So I combined those two worlds, and essentially that's where Prayerful Warrior Mom was born.
Tracy, as we close out here, and there are, listen, let me tell you, there are so many questions that I would still love to ask and go down. And I have to continue to remind myself, like, Benji, this is not about you, right? This is about Tracy's journey, but also about this magnificent book and how powerful of a resource it is for the community at large. And I think that this next question is going to be a powerful one and a great one to close out with. And I know it varies based upon the individual, based upon the circumstances, but I do think a point that you just referenced in terms of being that powerful voice for your son and knowing when to, within a certain parameter, right? Because as you mentioned, you didn't want to get kicked out of the hospital, but you know the borders in which you can go and question a particular diagnosis or something that has been stated or maybe not stated and missed by the physician. And, I have conversations like this with my wife all the time because my wife is a physician and she understands that as much as the physicians are the quote unquote experts in any given circumstance, the patients are the ones in the driver's seat. They are the ones in control. And I think that's a great point in and of itself to bring up to remind our listening audience. People, listen, if you find yourself in a similar circumstance, remember, because a physician tells you A, B, or C does not mean that you have to follow that to a T. Granted, they have gone to the schooling. They are the quote unquote experts. So you don't want to battle back against everything. But there are moments where you have that wiggle room where you can speak up. I want to hear it from you throughout your process. And again, I know this is specific to your circumstances, Tracy, but when did you find that it was appropriate to change or maybe battle back or question a certain thing or highlight something that maybe a physician had missed? Where do you think those parameters lie, and how did you go through the process of knowing when to speak up and talk about certain things?
I think I would get to the point where it was of desperation. I would be praying, of course, for answers and trying to understand and listen to the professionals, but also listening to my son and knowing that something had changed, something was not right.
Right.
And I think at a couple of the times where I can think of where I had to finally just stand up and say, can I please talk to someone else and get like their perspective, then and I always try to do it in a way where, I wasn't being combative, because that doesn't ever help anyone.
Yeah.
But if you come in as an approach where you're like, look, we're both trying to figure this out. We're both trying to help my son, but here's what I'm seeing, and try to lay out the things that didn't make sense to me. We had one particular instance where my son was actually being held to a formula-fed baby's standards, so we were overfeeding him. And they weren't going to let me take him home from the hospital until he hit this standard, and I was nursing him. So I was kind of pushing and saying that this doesn't make any sense. You're overfeeding him. Breastfed babies don't eat this much,
right,
nor is it even the same consistency as formula. And so I actually ended up getting to talk to a doctor who came over to sort of be the mediator. And after I explained my concerns and why I felt compelled to speak up and that I didn't think it was right, then she proceeds to say, well, she had nursed all three of her children. God's grace, in my opinion. God sent this woman to me because she had children that she breastfed. And she agreed and said, well, of course she explained to me why the nurses couldn't necessarily relate, because they weren't used to having a baby in the NICU that could nurse.
Yeah.
Some of those babies couldn't even be held by their mothers because their skin was translucent and would tear if they held them. So I understood, but then also the nurses were able to understand. And so, it just takes, I think, that point of this doesn't make sense, and I'm not going to sit back and allow my son to be overfed. It wasn't healthy for him, especially having a heart condition. And so I just had to keep pushing until finally I got somebody that would listen. And God sent me somebody who would listen that also understood.
People, so many valuable points that we have touched up on during today's interview. That last answer, again, there are so many gems, but that last answer had so much. Tracy, we have discussed so much information here today, and so much valuable information. But before we close out, is there anything that we haven't yet touched up on that you really want to make sure our listening audience is aware of?
Actually, I wanted to share that I have a 7-day scripture guide that is free for anyone who purchases either the print version or if you download the ebook, it's available for free. And it is a way to help people who maybe want to start that relationship with God or want to learn how to pray and maybe don't even know where to begin. So for each day for 7 days, you will receive the scripture for that day. I share a Bible story that summarizes a story that Jesus told in the Bible to kind of pique their interest to maybe go start reading his words for himself, and also the personal prayer that I've shared to help them start that dialogue with God.
I love this. People, as I mentioned, I could sit here, I could talk to Tracy for hours. There is so much here that we would love to cover. You know where you got to go to gather the rest of this. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, prayerfulwarrior.com. While you're at it, look in frequently, okay? Check back into her personal website frequently because Tracy is in the process of writing 2 other books. Now, they're still in creation, so you can't purchase them just yet. But I'm telling you, you're going to have more than enough to keep yourself occupied with Prayerful Warrior Mom. But as you check back in frequently, you're going to want to get your hands on those 2 other narratives to be released in the future because these are all absolutely imperative to add to your shelf. I'm telling you, get to know the name Tracy A. Ripley. She is a person of distinction. She embodies all of the aspects that we cover here on our network and we represent. And this is a name that you want to get reckoned with because she's going to be around here. And these books are magnificent. It starts with Prayerful Warrior Mom. Head on over there today, pick it up, get lost in it. While you're at it, get it as a gift to add to someone else's shelf. Tracy, this has been a true pleasure. An absolute honor. I really do mean that. Thank you once again for being a guest on People of Distinction.
Hey, Benji, I appreciate it.